I said before that this is not a neuroanatomy class, but we're going to briefly whiz through chapter 2. You're going to be shocked how fast I go through it. But then each of the systems, when we discuss them, we will talk a little bit about the anatomy, not a huge amount, not the level of detail that there is in the text, but we're just going to get oriented. This is a get oriented lecture. So the learning objectives for this lecture, I want you to be able to explain the difference between white and gray matter in the nervous system, list the names of a bundle of myelinated axons that travel together in the central nervous system, and to briefly describe the functions of the peripheral nervous system, the spinal region, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. And when I say briefly, I mean really briefly, just briefly. Okay. So like I said in the neuroimaging section, there are three planes, just like in the rest of the body, imaginary lines through the nervous system and imaginary planes. The sagittal plane separates the nervous system into right and left portions, horizontal into top and bottom halves. And because of that little 90-degree turn from the top of the brainstem into the cerebrum, the top half is up here, bottom half is down here. And that's horizontal. The coronal or frontal plane divides the brain into anterior and posterior portions, also known as dorsal and ventral. Ventral is anterior, dorsal is posterior. So hopefully you remember that from kinesiology last year. So on the cellular level, gray and white matters are visible cellular distinctions in the central nervous system. So you can see in this photograph of a brain, a coronal section of a brain, there is white, there's white area, and then there's gray area. So gray matter is the areas of the central nervous system that primarily contain neuron cell bodies and dendrites. And information is integrated in the gray matter. White matter consists of axons and myelin. So myelin is the fatty substance that coats the axons that speeds up nerve conduction. Axons are projections of nerve cells that usually convey information away from the cell body. Axons convey information among parts of the nervous system from one place to another, like the peripheral to the central. Myelin consists of cells that insulate the electrical conduction of axons, and we'll talk about the individual cells in upcoming chapters. And areas with large proportion of myelin appear white because of the high fat content of myelin. So myelin has a high fat content. Remember, fat is an insulator, if you remember from last quarter. And myelin insulates those nerve cells, those neurons. So any place where we see white in the nervous system, that is bundles of axons. They're taking information someplace. And any place where we see gray, those are the bodies, the cell bodies. And that's where information is being integrated. And neurotransmitters are being made, and lots of cool stuff is happening. So when you take sections of a brain and you use a myelin stain, the myelin shows up black or sometimes purple, depending on which stain you use. And so areas with large proportion of myelin appear white when you look at the actual brain, like here, and they appear black in a slide that has been stained with myelin stain. A bundle of myelinated axons that travel together in the central nervous system or from the peripheral to the central is called, there are lots of different names. Don't let that bug you. A tract, a lemniscus, a fasciculus, a column, a peduncle, or a capsule. So those are all bundles of myelinated axons that travel together in the central nervous system. Where a lot of times we're going to be calling them a tract, but all those other names also mean bundles of myelinated axons that travel together in the central nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system, there are afferent axons that carry information towards the central nervous system, and efferent, which carry information away from the central nervous system. So the example of an afferent axon is the peripheral sensory neurons. When you touch something, it sends that peripheral information up to your brain to tell you you're touching something. The example of efferent axons are axons that carry motor commands from the central nervous system down to the skeletal muscles. So when we talked about the peripheral nerves in kinesiology, um, we're talking basically about bundles of efferent axons. So in this figure, the dotted line indicates the transition from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. So anything on the right of the dotted line is peripheral, and to the left of the dotted line is central. So the peripheral system includes the somatic nervous system, which are axons and sensory nerve endings and glial cells that serve them, and the autonomic nervous system, which is entire neuron sensory endings, synapses, ganglia, and glia of the autonomic nervous system. So we'll talk about these in detail in their individual chapters. The central nervous system consists of three regions: spinal, brainstem and cerebellar, and the cerebrum. We're going to talk about the cerebrum first, after we talk about the general cellular structures and everything. The spinal region, so if you take a cross section of the spinal cord, it has gray matter in the middle that sort of forms like the shape of an H, surrounded by white matter. So what do we know about gray matter and white matter? Gray matter is where processing happens. That's where cell bodies are. And white matter is tracks of myelinated axons. So picture that in the spinal cord going up and down. The dorsal horn, so there's the horns, so it's like an H with little horns on it. The horns, there's a dorsal, um, a ventral, and a lateral horn. The dorsal horn contains the cell bodies of motor neurons, interneurons, and the endings of sensory neurons. So we'll talk in more detail about that. The gray matter in the spinal cord includes interneurons, which are taking from one to another. They're not afferent or efferent. The endings of sensory neurons and the cell bodies of neurons. The spinal region has two main functions, and that is to convey information between the neurons innervating the peripheral structures and the brain. To process information, there's a lot of processing that goes on in the spinal cord, and to convey somatosensory information to the brain, and from the brain to neurons that directly control movement. So lots of cool stuff going on in the spinal region. The brainstem is kind of, you can think of it as the top of the spine, or perhaps the boundary between the spine and the cerebrum. I want to think of it that way. It's shaped like a cylinder that's wider at the top. The three parts are the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. The medulla is short for medulla oblongata. Pons is the Latin word for bridge, and it's a bridge from the cerebrum to the cerebellum. Kind of interesting. And the midbrain has all sorts of interesting structures. So there are lots of fiber tracts carrying motor and sensory information traveling through the brainstem. Some tracks begin and end within the brainstem, but a lot of them are just going through. So pons, that's that bridge effect, if you want to think of it that way. The brainstem contains important groups of neurons that control our equilibrium, cardiovascular activity, respiration, and other functions. So if your brainstem is damaged, that could be really, really serious because it controls vital functions. And we'll talk about disorders of the brainstem later on. Cranial nerves are 12 pairs of nerves that emerge from the surface of the brain. Most of them innervate structures in the head, face, and neck, except the vagus nerve, which innervates thoracic and abdominal viscera, in addition to structures in the head and neck. The vagus nerve goes everywhere. The numbers of the nerves, 1 through 12, they're always written in Roman numerals just to make you review Roman numerals whenever you learned them in the second grade or whatever. They're numbered according to the site of attachment to the brain, anterior to posterior. So the sensory cranial nerves are olfactory, which is smell, optic, vision, vestibulocochlear, which is your vestibular system, your gravity system, and cochlear is your hearing. Motor nerves, some of the nerves have both motor and sensory fibers, but the oculomotor, eye movements, trochlear, adducens, accessory, and hypoglossal. Remember the accessory nerve, number 11, innervates the upper trapezius. And we'll talk about why that's important later on. There are cranial nerves that are mixed that have both sensory and motor. The trigeminal nerve, which innervates a lot of the sensation and movement in the face. The facial nerve, same thing. Glossopharyngeal, tongue and swallowing. And the vagus nerve, it's everywhere. You can't make a turn without running into the vagus nerve. The cerebellum is the hind brain, so it's kind of behind the cerebrum, if you want to think of it that way. It consists of two large cerebellar hemispheres and the midline vermis. It connects to the posterior brainstem by large bundles of fibers called peduncles, and they go through the pons. The superior, middle, and inferior peduncles join the midbrain pons and medulla with the cerebellum. And the cerebellum's function is to coordinate movements, and it's a big player in learning movement. So very interesting. The diencephalon, any structure with the word thalamus in it is part of the diencephalon. So it consists of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, epithalamus, and the subthalamus. They're all like right in the middle of the brain. Anything that's right in the middle, that seems like it's important, right? And it is. So we'll talk about their functions later on. So here's a rundown of basically of their functions. A lot of our vital function and our circadian rhythms and neural circuits that control movement are in the diencephalon. The thalamus itself has a bunch of nuclei that do tons of things for us. They process all sorts of sensation, memory, movement. They have a big role in consciousness, arousal, and attention. So the thalamus, right in the middle of the brain, very important. The cerebrum is what we think of as our brain. There's a longitudinal fissure that divides the two cerebral hemispheres. The surfaces of the cerebral hemispheres are marked by rounded elevations called gyri. A single one is a gyrus, and grooves called sulci. A single one is a sulcus. Everybody's brain is a smidge different, but they're enough the same that some of those the gyri and sulci can be named. So we're different but the same, just like everything, right? Just like all of our structures. But lots of stuff is going on in the cerebrum. The cerebral hemispheres, there are 6 of them, 6 lobes. The first 4, frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital, are named for the overlying bones of the skull. Then there's the limbic and the insular, which are a little more diffuse. The boundaries are approximate. So we can look at this picture of the brain and we can name frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal, but the insular and limbic are kind of a little more diffuse, and it's harder to pinpoint exactly where they are. The cerebral cortex, and each one has its own has different function. Vision is in the occipital lobe. Sensory is in the parietal lobe. Hearing and some of the processing of speech and memory is in the temporal lobe. Frontal lobe, God, the frontal lobe does everything, like motor, memory, emotion, cognition, executive function, lots of stuff going on in the frontal lobe. So each one has its own individual functions, but we'll talk about that in more detail later. The cerebral cortex is the entire surface of the cerebral hemispheres, and it's composed of gray matter. That's the cortex, is the gray matter. That's where we process sensory, motor, memory information. It's a site for reasoning, language, nonverbal communication, intelligence, and personality. So deep to the cerebral cortex is the white matter that's composed of axons connecting the cerebral cortex with other central nervous system areas. And there's a huge bundle of axons that connects right and left, and it's called the corpus callosum. The white matter of the hemispheres is all over the place because the information has to travel. But there are some additional areas of gray matter, and they tend to be towards the center of the brain. They're not on the cerebral cortex. And the basal ganglia, which is a big part on movement and decision making and cognitive function. There's a whole, I'm not going to list all the stuff about the basal ganglia. We'll talk about that later. The amygdala is involved in emotions and motivation. The hippocampus processes memory for facts, which, as we know in school, that's very important. So the declarative memory system, which is remembering facts and figures, that sort of thing, includes the hippocampus and the fornix and parts of the thalamus and cerebral cortex. Once you encode into long-term memory, a lot of it is stored in the frontal lobe. So there's memories is processed all over the brain. Sensory memory, motor memory, declarative memory, and we'll talk about the different types of memory. The cerebral spinal fluid system is a protection system for the brain. It's the cerebral spinal fluid itself is a modified filtrate of plasma, just like our blood plasma. It circulates from cavities inside the brain to the surface of the central nervous system, and then it's reabsorbed into the venous blood system. So the CSF system regulates the content of extracellular fluid and provides buoyancy to the central nervous system by suspending the brain and spinal cord within fluid and membranous coverings. The system consists of ventricles, which are the fluid lakes, if you want to think of it that way, and the meninges, which are the covering, the membranous coverings. So there are 4 ventricles. There are a pair of lateral ventricles located in the cerebral hemispheres in the middle. And the lateral ventricles are then connected to, so that's 1 and 2. Lateral ventricles are connected to the 3rd ventricle by the interventricular foramina. And the 3rd ventricle is a midline slit in the diencephalon, so kind of in between the 2 sides of the thalamus. And the 3rd and 4th ventricles are connected by the cerebral aqueduct. And the 4th ventricle is located posterior to the pons in the midbrain, and medulla, and anterior to the cerebellum. So it's kind of wedged in there between the midbrain and the hindbrain. And the cerebral spinal fluid leaves the 4th ventricle through the lateral foramina and the medial foramen to circulate around the central nervous system. And the ventricular system continues through the medulla and spinal cord as the central canal and then ends at the caudal spinal cord. The fluid within the ventricles is secreted by tissues called the choroid plexus. The meninges are the membranous coverings of the brain and spinal cord, and there are 3 layers. The dura mater, which is dura means tough, so it's named for its toughness. It has 2 projections that separate the parts of the brain. The arachnoid is named for its resemblance to a spider web. It's more webby than the dura mater. And the pia mater is a very delicate membrane that adheres to the surface of the central nervous system. The blood supply, there are 2 pairs of arteries that supply blood to the brain, the internal carotid arteries, which mostly supply blood to the cerebrum, and the vertebral arteries, if you recall, they go through the transverse foramina of the cervical vertebrae, and they provide blood to the occipital and inferior and temporal lobes and to the brainstem and cerebellar region. So the brain needs a constant supply of oxygen and glucose in order to work. And so this blood supply is super important. And after we talk about the individual cells, we're going to go right into cerebral spinal fluid and blood supply because it's pretty important, and the disorders associated with it. The circle of Willis is pictured here, and it's an anastomotic ring of 9 arteries that supply blood to the cerebral hemispheres. So there's 6 paired arteries that join together, or anastomos, via 3 small communicating arteries. So if one part is blocked, it could go another way for a while. So it's kind of interesting. There's some redundant systems. The blood supply in the brain is also filtered by glial cells, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But you don't want stuff crossing over the blood-brain barrier for the most part. The 3 major cerebral arteries are the anterior, middle, and posterior. The internal carotid branches into the anterior and middle, and the posterior continues from the circle of Willis as the 3rd major cerebral artery. And so we'll talk about, when we talk about strokes, what are the general effects of these particular arteries and what areas of the brain are involved. A really large percentage of ischemic strokes happen to the middle cerebral artery. And so the things that we think of as being typical stroke symptoms are middle cerebral artery symptoms. So we'll talk about the distinguishing features of each. Venous blood from the cerebrum drains into the dural sinuses or the venous sinuses, and the dural sinuses drain back into the jugular veins and then go back to the heart, to go to the lungs, get oxygenated, back out of the heart, back up to the brain. So circulation, just like our circulatory system every place else. But the brain is one area that cannot be deprived of its circulation. Really important.